July 11, 1944, 0600 hours. St. Lo hedgerows. A German Panzerfaust team crouches behind a tall Norman bank while a pair of M4 Sherman tanks grind into view, engines drumming against the damp air. The first Sherman halts, slews its turret left. Then, without flag, flare, or visible runner, the second accelerates, cuts across a field of fire that moments earlier was swept by mortar fragments, and covers a gap for dismounted infantry threading a lane in the bocage. To the German observers, the sequence looks instinctive, the kind of choreography officers once drilled by whistle and hand sign. Yet it repeats 2, 3, 4 times under artillery haze, as if the American platoon shares a single intention. The mystery is simple to describe and hard to solve. Why does this coordination persist when dust, noise, and fear should have scattered it? The answer, then invisible to most Wehrmacht troops, sat in the Sherman's bustle. An FM frequency modulation tank set that reduced the battlefield to a manageable conversation. The common assumption, shared by Allied crews who envied Panther armor and a 75mm KWK-42 gun, and by German infantry who feared the Tiger's silhouette, was that steel decided. Not armor thickness or caliber alone, but the web that linked crews to each other and to higher command, decided tempo more often. In U.S. armor, that web was built on FM sets, such as the SCR 508 and its variants, standardized on July 22, 1941, fitted to M4 Shermans in production, and paired with training that normalized radio-led control down to platoon level. German panzer units had radios earlier and widely, but most sets, like the few G5 transceiver at 27.0 to 33.3 MHz, used AM, amplitude modulation, more susceptible to engine noise and ignition hash, and in practice reserved flexible voice control to command tanks, rather than every vehicle in the troop. The visible arms race, armor, and guns obscured the invisible one. Which force could keep talking under stress? The core mechanism was straightforward. USE tank nets moved to low VHF FM in the 20.0 to 27.9 MHz band with crystal-controlled channels, typically 10 presets, transmitting around 25 to 30 watts. Power varied by installation and manual addition. For voice ranges on level ground of roughly 5 to 7 miles, 8 to 11 kilometers, when stationary, and somewhat less when moving or mask-limited. The point was not long range, but clear, low-fatigue speech inside a company fight. FM rejected much of the static and ignition noise that plagued AM. A clipped consonant carried. Squelch kept the net quiet until someone had something to say, and crews stopped shouting over crackle. German few G5 sets worked well by 1940 standards and enabled blitzkrieg. By 1944, AM voice under hedgerow conditions meant shorter practical ranges, approximately 2 to 3 kilometers voice versus 3 to 4 kilometers CW, continuous wave, and more interference in the clutter near engines and power lines. Not heavier armor or longer barrels, but cleaner speech and predictable channelization turned dispersed tanks and infantry into a single organism. What this did to human beings mattered as much as what it did to circuits. A tank commander who could call, "Left edge 30 yards, suppress, move," and know he would be heard in under a second was not guessing. He was collaborating. The intercom, built into the same set in the Sherman, lowered crew workload. Gunner took talk from the commander's throat microphone without the loader losing the net. Driver heard route changes without a heel on his shoulder. Certainty, even in small doses and even over 200 yards of hedgerow, translated into initiative. Crews took short exposures, repositioned on cues, and trusted that a gap would be covered because they had just confirmed it by voice. Not bravado or thickness of plate, but the assurance that someone would answer when called. The first comparative thread sits at the intersection of technology and doctrine. U.S. doctrine in 1944 expected every tank in the platoon to be on the platoon net and to shift by SOP to company or battalion nets when required. Many command tanks added a second set, e.g. SCR 506, to listen upward while talking downward, preserving simultaneity with higher headquarters without silencing the local fight. German practice, efficient early in the war, often concentrated multi-set capability in troop or company leaders. Line tanks with single sets were netted laterally, but had fewer paths for simultaneous coordination across echelons under fire. In numbers, a U.S. Sherman platoon of 5 tanks might carry 5 primary FM sets, 5 SCR 508, with the platoon leader's tank carrying an additional long-range set. A comparable Panzer IV platoon likely had few G5 in each tank, with the leader's vehicle adding a second set for higher link. The difference emerged in noise rejection and net discipline, not mere radio count. Not the sum of sets or the wattage alone, but the way channelized FM plus universal issue created a low-friction habit of immediate voice control from the bottom up. 2 cautions keep the claim honest. First, range and clarity varied with terrain, antenna condition, and motion. A 7-mile figure from a manual presumed level, open ground, and proper tuning, while a hedgerow lane might collapse working ranges to under a mile. All the more reason FM's quieting mattered. Second, Allied units could and did suffer net discipline failures, battery issues, or sets shaken out of alignment. German sets, especially in early war conditions and with experienced Funker crews, delivered excellent results, and Luftwaffe ground links with few G7 proved capable when interference was low. The edge case is thus revealing. When the air was quiet and the ground open, say, in the desert at 10 miles per hour on firm going, AM's disadvantages narrowed. When engine noise and electrical hash framed the fight, say, second gear in Norman orchards, FM's squelch and capture effect widened them. Not a universal law or a magic radio, but a systematic probability tilt. The principle that emerges is technical and generalizable. Platforms fight as objects in space, but networks fight as flows of timing and intention. In 1944, U.S. Shermans carried not just 75mm guns and 2-inch smoke mortars, but low VHF FM links that turned 5 hulls and a rifle squad into a web of awareness. The Germans saw armor and silhouettes. They rarely saw the reason that, under artillery and dust, American platoons still moved like a single organism. In engineering terms, the addition of FM, crystal-controlled preset channels with universal distribution, reduced coordination latency and cognitive load more than any small increase in armor thickness could compensate. Not thicker plate or longer barrels, but cleaner, common speech, enforced by doctrine and logistics, multiplied combat power. In short, platforms engage, networks decide. The Sherman's radio advantage was not mystical, it was mechanical, electrical, and institutional, and it kept working when engines roared and nerves frayed. In plain terms, U.S. tank nets operated on low VHF FM, frequency modulation, with crystal-controlled preset channels, typically 10, and about 25 watts transmitter power in the BC604, the heart of the SCR 508 set. FM's quieting and capture effect meant that once the signal exceeded noise by a modest margin, speech arrived clean. Squelch kept headphones silent until someone transmitted, reducing fatigue and letting short, decisive calls cut through. By design, the set was for short, tactical voice, stationary ranges around 5 to 7 miles on level ground, less when moving or masked by hedgerows. The point was clarity, not reach. The same chassis drove the tank intercom, so crew coordination and platoon voice shared a common, reliable backbone. Against this, the German baseline in most Panzer IV and Panther platoons was the Fu-G-5AM, amplitude modulation, transceiver at 27.0 to 33.3 MHz, with roughly 10 watts output. In practice, it delivered approximately 2 to 3 kilometers voice range and somewhat longer in Morse, CW. The network logic differed. Leaders often carried an extra receiver, FUG-2, to monitor higher nets while talking on the platoon net. A clever solution that nevertheless kept true dual-path talk and listen capacity concentrated in command vehicles. In open steppe or desert, AM's disadvantages narrowed. In hedgerows and towns, ignition hash and multipath degraded audibility and increased operator fatigue. Not radios or no radios, but FM versus AM under noise, and universal down-to-every-tank FM practice versus capability concentrated at the top. Mechanically, FM mattered most at the moment of doubt. With engines at 2,000 RPM and the hull shuddering, a commander needed to issue a 7-word correction. Shift right 30 yards, short halt, fire. And trust that gunners 3 tanks over heard the consonants, not just the vowels. The SCR-508's crystal channelization prevented drift. A platoon that rehearsed Channel 3 for local, Channel 1 for company, understood in its muscles how to deconflict a net and how to step up without silence. This was a human factor as much as a technical one. The net was quiet until needed, and when needed, it was simple. The contrast frame holds, not brute volume or range, but predictable, low-friction speech that preserved timing when seconds mattered. Institutions turned sets into tempo. The SCR-508 was standardized on July 22, 1941, and built at scale. Turret bustles and mounts were literally designed around it, making the radio a default, not a special. Command tanks frequently added a long-range set, e.g. SCR-506, to listen upward while talking downward, preserving simultaneity without muting the platoon. Because the intercom rode on the same system, training taught crews a single workflow for inside the tank and tank-to-tank talk, lowering cognitive load. In short, standardization in hardware and procedure made voice control routine. Not ad hoc wiring or a gifted operator, but an Army-wide design decision that could be drilled, inspected, and maintained. 2 time-stamped field patterns show how invisible linkage produced measurable outcomes. In the Bocage fights west of St. Lo, July 1944, infantry tank teams that rehearsed net discipline and brevity codes used FM voice to walk guns from hedge to hedge with exposures under 10 seconds, keeping movement aligned with the instantaneous sighting of a single squad. When a lane opened, platoons shifted laterally on call to cover rifles probing the next bank. German AARS from the sector emphasized the suddenness of American lateral movement. The physical distances were small, fields 100 to 200 yards across, but the timing was compounded by seconds saved on each call. In Lorraine, September 1944, longer sightlines let companies coordinate leapfrogs at 10 to 15 miles per hour on firm going. Clear FM nets sustained platoon company synchronization across 1 to 2 miles without messengers and with fewer halts, translating to more ground per hour before the enemy could reset. Not larger guns or thicker glacis, but the maintenance of collective timing over distance. Two contrasts make the point sharp. First, AM versus FM. Both could carry voice, but FM's threshold behavior and squelch changed the crew's lived day. Fewer repeats, less fatigue, better short-word intelligibility in noise. Second, universal issue versus command tank-centric architecture. German practice often gave the richest radio capability to leaders with FUG-5 plus FUG-2, while U.S. practice put fully capable FM sets in every line tank and trained leaders to add, not monopolize, radios. The effect in action was not louder orders, but more parallel decision-making. Wingmen could coordinate micro-maneuvers laterally without waiting for the troop leader to clear the net. Not hierarchy or heroics, but distributed, low-latency talk. Limits mattered. Batteries failed, antennas snapped in brush, and net discipline could break under stress. Some U.S. units reported crosstalk when two platoons forgot to separate channels, and sets knocked out of alignment by shell bursts lost the FM advantage until retuned. German sets in the right conditions, open desert, careful ignition suppression, performed well, and experienced funker crews could squeeze range from AM that manuals did not promise. Sources differ on average working ranges in the bocage, with credible figures from under a mile to about 3 miles depending on mast height and ground. This variability is itself the point. FM preserved intelligibility deeper into clutter. Not perfection, but a better slope against friction. The principle is compact. An army that standardizes low-latency, low-fatigue voice to the lowest echelon and trains to use it as habit turns geography into timing. Timing becomes initiative. FM sets in Sherman platoons did not make armor thicker, but they made decisions arrive on time. And that often mattered more than inches of plate. North Africa offered the clean test and the caution. On hard desert near Spitla in early 1943, sightlines stretched and dust rose, but engine interference was lower and the ground was radio-friendly. Under those conditions, German AM sets in Panzer III-4 could sustain workable voice across several kilometers, narrowing the advantage of US FM. When wind picked up and dust plumes thickened, however, FM's capture effect kept short, intelligible orders flowing inside US, platoons advancing at 8 to 12 miles per hour, while AM nets required more repeats and hand signals. The net edge was measurable in halts avoided rather than kills claimed. One fewer minute-long stop per 1,000 yards adds up over a morning. Sources differ on exact ranges recorded by crews, but contemporary manuals and post-war notes align on the pattern. In noise, FM cleared the threshold sooner. Not universal dominance, but a persistent probability shift. Normandy's hedgerows reversed every advantage that depended on visibility and made the invisible decisive. In the maze west of Isigny, June to July 1944, platoons operated with mutual support distances under 300 yards and needed to shift fires within 3 to 5 seconds of a call. The SCR 508's preset channels and squelch allowed tank infantry teams to maintain a quiet net, then spike short commands without stepping on each other, while commanders used a second set in command tanks to keep the company picture coherent without silencing the platoon talk. German infantry, often without radios at squad level, relied on whistles and runners. Panzer platoons had radios but faced the same ignition and multipath issues as everyone else, with AM voice degrading more harshly in the hedges. The result, noted in German reports as surprising lateral moves, was simply seconds saved in each micro-decision. Not massed assaults or superior armor, but a local web of awareness. Urban and mountain terrain forced improvisation. At Aachen, October 1944, reflection and shadowing in narrow streets produced dead spots. U.S. crews responded by standardizing antenna checks at every halt, swapping damaged whips, and, when necessary, relaying through a tank positioned at a street mouth to maintain line of sight, an elementary but drilled expedient. In the Liri Valley near Cassino, slopes and ravines forced platoons to deploy relay points and to fall back on prearranged brevity codes when signal to noise collapsed. These were not exotic tricks. They were simple practices that assumed radios were the primary control method and that the net must be preserved. German practice, too, adapted. Panzer leaders put antenna mast protection into SOPs and used FUG-2 to keep a second ear on higher headquarters. But the AM baseline still punished voice in noise. Not technology alone, but the discipline to keep the net alive. Failure modes were humanly specific. A loader snagged the mast base and cracked an insulator. A dynamotor brush wore down and voltage dipped. A commander overtalked the net and masked lateral coordination. Units learned to assign a radio guard inside each platoon, often the assistant driver, to watch net discipline, log brevity violations, and cue maintenance at the next bound. Maintenance sections carried spare DM3436 dynamotors and whip sections. A 10-minute swap restored power and, with it, the platoon's ability to act as one. German crews had their own routines, and experienced Funker operators could nurse ailing sets far beyond nominal limits. When air was quiet and the ground open, the playing field nearly leveled. The edge case shows the shape of the advantage. When friction rose, a shell burst nearby. A street corner reflected signal. Engines howled in low gear. FM nets recovered intelligibility sooner. Not invulnerability, but resilience. Adversary adaptation deserves credit. German signals troops experimented with jamming at higher frequencies and with deception nets, but widespread, effective jamming against U.S. low VHF-FM tank nets did not materialize at scale. The technical hurdle was non-trivial, and the frontline priority was usually artillery and higher-level nets. More effective were tactical counters, sniping antenna masts, ambushing relay tanks, and exploiting the moment when a platoon leader shifted sets to talk up the chain. U.S. units responded by adding leaders' second sets where possible and codifying talk-while-you-move rules to prevent the platoon from going silent when the boss looked upward. Not technology frozen in place, but a contest of procedures riding on hardware. Human effects tie the cases together. Connected crews reported lower uncertainty and shorter exposure times. Isolated crews, whether by damage, bad terrain, or discipline lapses, slowed, bunched, and hesitated. The repeatable lesson filtered into standing orders by late 1944. Check the net at every bound, protect the mast, rehearse channel changes, keep lateral talk short and specific. Keep a second ear for hire only if you can do so without muting the fight. Commanders learned quickly because the feedback loop was immediate. A clear net bought yards and seconds. A noisy net cost them. Not inspiration or intimidation, but an engineered reduction in doubt, scaled by doctrine. The doctrine summary is blunt. By late 1944, U.S. armored SOPs assumed FM nets were the primary control system and treated armor, guns, and speed as instruments to be timed by voice. When friction rose, they added relay, brevity, and dual net habits to keep timing intact. The result across desert, hedgerow, and city was not constant superiority, but a persistent edge in initiative where it mattered most. in the next 30 seconds. Platforms fought. The network decided when. Operation Cobra, launched July 25, 1944, after an approximately 3,000 sortie bombardment, depended not only on mass, but on keeping small, fast-moving armor infantry groups synchronized as they threaded through the wreckage south of St. Lo. Company and battalion nets carried fragmentary orders, while platoon FM, frequency modulation, nets, crystal preset, low VHF, short range, translated intent into micro-maneuvers across 100 to 300 yards of hedgerow. The operational signature was tempo. 8 Corps reported advances of 6 to 12 miles, 10 to 19 kilometers per day by July 28th to 30th, with many halts measured in minutes rather than hours. 1st U.S. Army, AAR, 1944. German defenders, cut by bomb craters and lacking radios below company in many infantry formations, perceived fluidity as unexpected lateral movement, a tactical symptom of an operational property. Timing preserved across many small actions. Not heavier armor or longer barrels, but the ability to keep conversation coherent while moving fast through clutter turned a breach into a breakout. Aracourt, September 19th to 29th, 1944, is the counter-image in open country. The 4th Armored Division fought mixed panzer brigades in Lorraine fog, where visibility fell under 600 yards. Here, the U.S. advantage was not in vulnerability. Panther guns at 2,950 feet per second, approximately 900 meters per second, still killed. But the cohesion of dispersed teams who could talk while the fog suppressed line of sight. Company commanders used dual-set tanks to monitor battalion while keeping platoon FM nets free for short fire orders. Sections leapfrogged at 10 to 15 miles per hour on firm going, called bearings in degrees rather than hand signals, and broke contact before encirclement tightened. The measurable outputs were engagement density and recovery time. More fights started at favorable angles, and damaged platoons reformed in tens of minutes rather than hours. Combat Command A Journals, 1944. Not AM, amplitude modulation, versus FM as an abstraction, but a 5 to 7 mile stationary voice capacity that, even compressed to under a mile by fog and folds, stayed intelligible enough to manage bearings, bounds, and ammunition calls. Remagen, March 7th, 1945, shows where radios matter and where they do not. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge owed to German explosives failing and to local initiative by infantry and engineers. FM tank nets did not seize steel. What they did was compress the window between a surprise crossing and the arrival of armor on the far bank. Within hours, battalion-level voice kept ferries, traffic control, and perimeter tanks on overlapping nets, reducing idle gaps and avoiding self-inflicted gridlock on narrow roads. The bridgehead expanded at approximately 1 to 2 miles per day in its first week under heavy artillery and counterattacks. 3rd Corps reports, March 1945. Not radios as a cause of strategic fortune, but radios as a guardrail that stopped fortune from being squandered. Production and logistics turned a technical edge into a theater habit. Sherman production exceeded 49,000 hulls. The more relevant figure is how many left the line with radio mounts, power takeoffs, and space disciplined by a standard, so replacements slotted in without bespoke wiring. Ordnance Department, 1945. SCR 508 family sets, along with intercom boxes and dynamotors, were manufactured by multiple firms under common drawings. Field depots stocked spares as line items, with repair cycles measured in hours to days. Training synchronized with supply. Radio procedure appeared in armored force school syllabi by 1942. Brevity tables and channel plans were printed and laminated at company level by 1944. The human effect: lower anxiety, fewer repeats, faster recovery from confusion, was purchased by predictable logistics. Not a brilliant improvisation at the front, but thousands of small, boring consistencies that made talk first the default reflex. German adaptation and awareness remained uneven. Panzer units had been radio-rich since 1939. The few G5AM set at 27.0 to 33.3 MHz was ubiquitous, and troop leaders added receivers, e.g., few G2, to monitor higher echelons. In open steppe or desert, AM's disadvantages narrowed. In hedgerows and towns, ignition noise and multipath punished voice, jamming against U.S. low VHF-FM tank nets appears in signals files mostly as intent rather than widespread effect. Frontline German jammers focused on higher-value artillery and core nets. Here's Nachrichten, 1944-45. The more practical countermeasures were tactical. Shoot masts, ambush relay vehicles, force leaders to split attention between up nets and down nets. Where German combined arms cohesion remained high and radios were intact. On early phases of the Ardennes on December 16 to 18, 1944, surprise, weather, and massed artillery overcame local U.S. net advantages. Not communications alone or firepower alone, but their interaction with surprise, terrain, and logistics determined outcomes. Allied variance also matters. British and Commonwealth armor in 1944-45 increasingly fielded number 19 sets, AM with an intercom and a VHF-B set, and refined net discipline. Canadian AARS in Normandy note rapid company-level retasking by voice. Soviet practice evolved from 1941's radio scarcity, T-34 platoons often signaled by flag, to 1944-45's wider VHF adoption in Guards formations. When Red Army units saturated a sector, voice nets coordinated artillery and armor timing, even if individual tank-to-tank talk lagged Western FM clarity. Glance, 1998. Sources differ on set densities by front. These edge cases sharpen the rule. Where every vehicle can talk clearly, lateral coordination becomes routine rather than leader-mediated. Where only leaders can talk, initiative compresses to fewer minds, and friction finds the seams. The post-war legacy ran on two tracks: hardware and doctrine. Hardware stayed with VHF-FM for armor and infantry. The AN/VRC-8, 9, 10 family in the 1950s. The AN/PRC-25 in the 1960s at 30.00 to 75.95 MHz with 920 channel steps. And NATO allies fielding analogous sets, GUAG. In Bundeswehr SEM-25, that preserved the same virtues: preset channels, squelch, reasonable power, and man-portable or vehicle-borne commonality. Doctrine generalized the wartime lesson. Mission-type orders, what and why, ride on dependable, low-latency voice at the lowest echelon so that how can be adjusted on contact. By the 1990s, the metaphor shifted. Net-centric, C2, command and control. But the physics remained. The most valuable watt is the one that reduces uncertainty in the next 30 seconds. There are boundaries. Radios do not negate terrain that blocks line of sight, nor do they overcome fuel shortages, poor combined arms integration, or saturation bombardment that shreds antennas and crews alike. Urban canyons create dead zones. Mountains make relays non-optional. Electromagnetic congestion, friendly and enemy, can raise the noise floor until even FM's capture effect fails. Organizations can also defeat their own advantage. Overtalked nets, ambiguous brevity, or leader monopolies that force everything through a single transmitter will erase the distributed timing that makes small units agile. Not a talisman, but a tool whose value is proportional to discipline and design. Return to the hedgerow at St. Lo. What German soldiers read as uncanny choreography was simply a platoon whose radios were quiet until they were not, whose brevity words were drilled, whose leaders could listen up while talking down, and whose supply sergeant had a spare dynamotor in the truck. The visible contest, 75mm versus 75mm, glacis angled at 47 degrees, muzzle velocity numbers to the second decimal, mattered. The invisible contest, whether 5 tanks and a rifle squad could act as one organism under pressure, mattered more often. In the Second World War's arithmetic of timing, the Sherman's most advanced radios were not magic. They were a system that converted watts into certainty and certainty into initiative. The rule, stated without romance, is this: armor and guns create the capacity to win a fight, but only a reliable, standardized, low-latency network creates the probability of winning many fights in sequence. Platforms engage, networks decide, logistics and discipline make the decision repeatable.